For many years, Pastor Robert Morris was known as one of the most respected voices in modern Christianity. To his followers, he was more than just a preacher on a stage. He was seen as a spiritual father, a man whose words carried both wisdom and comfort. Robert Morris was the founder of Gateway Church in South Texas. What started with only a small group of people meeting in a rented space slowly grew into one of the largest churches in America. His sermons, often simple but deeply meaningful, spoke about generosity, healing, faith, and hope. Millions of people across the world connected with his teaching through online platforms, conferences, books, and television broadcasts. His ability to speak to the heart of ordinary people helped Gateway Church expand into a global ministry. To many, Robert Morris was not only preaching faith, he was living it in an authentic way that gave people confidence in his leadership. His reputation grew stronger year after year, and his name became a symbol of trust and inspiration within the Christian community. People saw him as a man who built something extraordinary from nothing, and his church became a home for thousands who wanted guidance in their spiritual journeys. As Gateway Church expanded and Robert Morris's influence grew, not everyone saw only success. Some staff members began noticing troubling changes within the leadership culture. Decisions that were once made openly were now being discussed behind closed doors. Volunteers who once felt part of the mission noticed that their questions and input were no longer welcomed. Instead, the church began to feel more tightly controlled. Whispers about the way church funds were being managed started to spread. Though most people dismissed these concerns as rumors or simple misunderstandings, a few insiders claimed that large amounts of money were being used for projects and expenses that seemed unusual. Meanwhile, Robert's personal behavior also started to raise eyebrows. He occasionally missed important meetings, took unexplained trips, and sometimes displayed emotional outbursts in staff gatherings. While some dismissed these as signs of stress, others quietly wondered if something more serious was happening. Most people remained silent, unwilling to question a man who had built such a successful ministry. But in the background, a few began keeping records of what they observed. These notes, though hidden at first, would later become important in the story that followed. The turning point came when a former accountant from Gateway Church decided she could not stay silent any longer. She had worked faithfully in the finance department for more than a decade and had always respected Robert Morris. However, in her last 2 years at the church, she began noticing what she called red flags. She saw large sums of money being shifted into unnamed accounts, expenses for luxury hotels and private travel being marked as ministry costs, and even renovations of private property being written off as church spending. When she raised questions, she was told to stop asking and simply stay in her lane. Feeling uneasy, she resigned and began documenting everything she had seen. Eventually, her story reached journalists, and an independent Christian watchdog blog published an anonymous report about possible financial misconduct inside Gateway Church. At first, the church strongly denied the accusations, calling them baseless and harmful. But as more voices came forward, the story gained national attention. Soon, media outlets picked it up, and outside organizations, including the IRS, began to quietly investigate the financial dealings of the church. What started as whispers now became a storm that could not be ignored. A year after the first reports, the unthinkable happened. Robert Morris was officially indicted on several charges, including tax evasion, misuse of nonprofit funds, and wire fraud. The news sent shockwaves across the Christian community. For many, it felt impossible to believe. The man they had trusted for years, who had guided them spiritually, was now facing serious criminal accusations. The trial became a major media event, though cameras were not allowed inside the courtroom. Reporters described every detail from outside as Robert entered wearing a gray suit, appearing tired and weighed down. Prosecutors presented strong evidence, including documents that showed church funds being used for luxury cars, vacation homes, and other personal expenses. Emails suggested Robert had personally approved some of these questionable transactions. Former staff members and church members were called as witnesses, many of whom broke down in tears as they spoke about their trust and sacrifices. Robert himself eventually testified, admitting that mistakes had been made. He said that the ministry had grown too quickly, that he had been under immense pressure, and that he had let success blind him. "I let my success become my idol," he confessed. While some sympathized, the law cared more about the actions than the intentions. After weeks of evidence and testimonies, the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all major charges. The courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. Looking directly at Robert Morris, the judge declared that he had stood in a position of sacred trust but used that trust to cover greed. The punishment was severe: a long prison term and millions of dollars in restitution to be paid back to donors and former staff members. As the sentence was read, gasps filled the room. Some people cried openly, while others looked down, unable to process what had just happened. Robert Morris, once a beloved pastor, was now led away in handcuffs, silent and not looking back. For many of his followers, the scene felt like more than just the fall of one man. It felt like their own faith had been shaken. How could someone who had preached forgiveness, truth, and integrity fall so deeply into corruption? In the weeks that followed the verdict, Gateway Church was left in silence. For 2 Sundays, services were not held, leaving members confused and heartbroken. Eventually, an interim pastor was brought in, and a public apology was issued. The leadership promised major changes, including financial restructuring and new accountability measures. Robert's books were pulled from Christian bookstores. His name was removed from the church's website, and his television ministry shut down without announcement. It was almost as if the church was trying to erase his presence completely. Followers were divided in their reactions. Some defended Robert, saying he had been unfairly treated, while many felt betrayed and broken. "I gave years of my life to this ministry," one former staff member said, "and now it feels like it was all a lie." The scandal left a deep scar on the Christian world, forcing people to rethink the risks of following celebrity pastors. The phrase, "goodbye forever," began to circulate among former members and observers. It was not only about Robert Morris stepping away from ministry, but also about the grief and disillusionment that came with his downfall. For some, it was a goodbye to Gateway Church, a place they once considered their spiritual home. For others, it was a goodbye to blind trust in leaders. A few, shaken to the core, even said goodbye to their faith entirely, unsure of what to believe anymore. The story of Robert Morris raised difficult questions. Was he always deceiving people, or did he simply lose his way under the weight of success? Could anyone truly be trusted in such positions of power? These questions left an echo in the Christian community that would not fade quickly. The tragedy was not just in one man's fall, but in the broken trust of thousands who had once believed so deeply in him. The downfall of Robert Morris serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power in religious institutions. When one person becomes larger than the mission itself, accountability can disappear, and corruption can quietly grow. Churches are meant to be places of faith, healing, and service. But scandals like this show how quickly things can go wrong when transparency is lost. For believers, it is also a call to focus not on human leaders, but on the faith itself. Leaders may fail, but faith does not have to. The Christian community continues to wrestle with the painful lessons of this story, hoping that greater accountability and humility will prevent future tragedies. What remains clear is that the story of Robert Morris is not just about one pastor. It is about the importance of integrity, truth, and responsibility in all positions of leadership. Robert Morris's story cannot be fully understood without looking closely at how Gateway Church became so influential in modern Christianity. From the very beginning, Robert was known for his energy, vision, and ability to inspire others. Unlike some leaders who prefer to stay behind the scenes, he was always visible and approachable, which made people feel personally connected to him. His leadership style was often described as both gentle and commanding. Gentle when he spoke to individuals in need of encouragement, and commanding when he shared his vision for the church's future. Gateway's early members often said that Robert had a unique way of making each person feel important. Even as the church grew from dozens to thousands, he could stand on stage in front of 10,000 people, yet his words would feel like they were meant for one heart at a time. This ability helped Gateway attract people from many different backgrounds, including those who had never considered going to church before. Another part of his leadership success was his use of modern tools. While many traditional churches resisted technology, Robert embraced online streaming, television ministry, and publishing books that reached global audiences. He was among the first pastors to realize that a local church could become an international platform if technology was used effectively. His conferences filled large arenas, and his sermons reached millions through broadcast. This blend of charisma, vision, and modern strategy made Robert Morris a model for many younger pastors who wanted to grow their ministries. But as the church became larger, so did the weight of responsibility. The bigger Gateway became, the harder it was to maintain the same transparency and closeness that had marked its early years. Members who had been with Gateway from the beginning often said that something changed over the years. At first, the church felt like a big family, where leaders and members worked side by side and decisions were made openly. But as Gateway grew, the culture slowly shifted. Leadership meetings became less about open discussion and more about top-down announcements. Some volunteers noticed that they no longer had access to the same leaders who once greeted them warmly. Financial decisions, once shared with members in detail, began to be discussed privately among a small group of insiders. These changes were subtle, and many people ignored them, choosing instead to focus on the church's continued growth and success. After all, Gateway was still expanding, and the sermons still inspired thousands. But behind the scenes, staff turnover began to rise. People who had once been deeply committed started leaving quietly, offering vague reasons such as "it was time" or "I felt called elsewhere." Few wanted to openly criticize Robert or the leadership, but whispers spread about the stress, secrecy, and pressure behind closed doors. This change in atmosphere may not have been visible to the average churchgoer, but those working close to Robert saw it clearly. And while many loved him deeply and respected his work, a growing number began to question whether the church's success had started to overshadow its spiritual foundation. One of the biggest issues in the story of Robert Morris was the way finances were handled. In churches as large as Gateway, money flows in constantly through donations, book sales, events, and media. With such large sums involved, financial transparency is extremely important. However, according to insiders, Gateway's financial structure became increasingly complex. Funds were sometimes moved between accounts without clear explanations. Luxury expenses were categorized as ministry-related, and staff members who asked questions were often dismissed. This lack of accountability became the foundation for the later scandal. The accountant who eventually spoke out described years of watching these red flags pile up. She had hoped that by raising her concerns quietly, someone would listen, but instead, she was told to stop asking questions. Her frustration grew until she felt she had no choice but to resign. What makes her story so powerful is that she had no desire to harm Robert or Gateway. In fact, she had loved the church deeply, but her conscience could not allow her to ignore what she had seen. This moment shows the importance of accountability in any large organization, especially one built on trust and faith. When people in positions of responsibility are silenced instead of heard, problems can only grow larger. When Robert Morris's trial began, the legal arguments and evidence were the center of attention. But beyond the documents, witnesses, and courtroom speeches, there was a deeply human side to the story. Many of the witnesses were not strangers. They were former staff members, volunteers, and churchgoers who had once trusted Robert with their lives. Their testimonies were not just about money. They were about broken trust. People cried as they remembered giving everything they had: time, energy, even their savings, because they believed in Robert's vision. To stand in court and speak against the man who had baptized them, married them, or prayed with them was heartbreaking. For Robert himself, the trial was equally painful. Though he tried to defend himself, his own words revealed a man who knew he had lost his way. His admission that he had allowed success to become his idol was powerful because it echoed what many others had suspected. Still, for the law, regret was not enough. Intentions could not erase the misuse of funds. For the faithful watching the trial unfold, the hardest part was reconciling the Robert they knew, the pastor who taught them about forgiveness and faith, with the Robert on trial for fraud and greed. This emotional conflict left many struggling with questions that went beyond the courtroom. The aftermath of Robert Morris's sentencing went far beyond Gateway Church. For many Christians around the world, the story was a shock that forced them to examine their own faith. If a man as respected as Robert could fall, who else might be hiding secrets? This created a wave of distrust toward celebrity pastors and large churches. People began asking whether churches should ever grow so large that one man holds all the power. Others pointed out that the Bible itself warns against putting too much faith in human leaders or Robert's direct followers. The pain was personal. Some felt betrayed and angry, while others remained loyal, believing he had been treated unfairly. Divisions grew within Gateway and among the wider Christian community. Some members left the church completely unable to continue in a place tied to scandal. Others stayed, hoping to rebuild under new leadership. Beyond the institution, the scandal also affected individual faith journeys. A few people admitted that their trust in God was shaken, not because of God himself, but because the man they had trusted as a messenger had fallen so far. This highlights the deep emotional and spiritual cost of such scandals. It is not only about money or legal issues, it is about the faith of thousands being put to the test. Robert Morris's story is not just about one pastor or one church. It reflects a larger challenge facing modern Christianity. When churches grow into megachurches and leaders become celebrities, the line between spiritual service and personal ambition can become blurred. The downfall of Robert Morris shows the importance of accountability, humility, and transparency in ministry. No matter how gifted or charismatic a leader may be, no one is above the need for oversight. In fact, the bigger the influence, the greater the responsibility to remain transparent. This story also teaches that followers must be careful not to place blind trust in any single leader. Faith should ultimately rest in God, not in human beings. Leaders can inspire, guide, and teach, but they are still human and capable of failure. The pain of Robert Morris's downfall is real, but it can also be an opportunity for churches everywhere to reflect, strengthen their structures, and avoid repeating the same mistakes. In this sense, the scandal, though tragic, may serve as a wake-up call for both leaders and followers. When people look back on the life and ministry of Robert Morris, the memory will likely be divided. On one hand, he built one of the largest churches in America, wrote books that touched millions, and inspired countless people to grow in their faith. On the other hand, his legacy